I thought at the time that that sounded like something I might be interested in. But in any case, I finished that and got a job as a contractor for the Department of Education, and we did a study on student loans. And after working on that job, as a contractor for about 5-6 months, I got a call from a friend who worked for the government, Department of Defense, asking if I was interested in a government job. So I worked with him and applied for that, and that's how I got into the Department of Defense, and things have worked out pretty well. One of the interesting things I found was that much of what I thought and others I knew thought and were involved in information technology were not things I ever had to do. For example, I've never been a programmer. One or two people I knew kind of discouraged me from going into computer technology because I thought I'd kind of be a faceless number sitting in a cubicle somewhere writing programs anonymously, but that hasn't been the case at all. There's really a wide variety of kinds of work you can do in information technology.
So you don't do very much programming at all?
None.
None?
When I first got in, I got right into what they called data modeling and data administration.
Okay.
I learned how to design data models. That's a graphical representation of information that a database is going to use.
Okay.
And so it forms the foundation of a database design.
Okay.
And oddly, one of the great skills that you needed to do that properly was a facility with language. And my English degree actually came in handy
that's good.
for that, because when you were creating these data models, you had to understand the meaning of words and how they related to each other and be able to define them clearly and concisely, some of those kinds of things.
Okay. So what is it, would you say, you like most about your job?
Well, I enjoyed, for one thing, working with words and information and organizing information and deciding how it would be most efficient to use it in a database. I also have the ability to work well with groups of people and communicate fairly well. For a long time, one of the biggest programs that I worked on was a data standardization program. And this was an adventurous effort by the department to try and actually generate standard data for the entire department. In other words, all the services, all the agencies, all the organizations in the Department of Defense would come up with a certain standard. For example, a person's name would have to be within this many characters and be defined in a certain way and related to other certain kinds of information in particular ways, and so you'd have to define all the names and definitions, and for mathematical related data, quantitative data, you'd have to come up with highs and low ranges and other things like that. But in any case, it was an effort to come up with standard pieces of data for the entire department so that whenever someone built a system in any service or agency, they'd use the same pieces of information to cover the same requirement. And that meant you had to get groups of people from DoD together, and in an effort to have them come to agree on how that data would be named and defined and so forth.
Okay.
That was not easy. In fact, after a certain number of years in that effort, they decided it wasn't going to work. And the products we produced have been useful in some ways, but it never really achieved the full potential that they were hoping. So they're using different approaches to try and foster that system interoperability now. Most of the current efforts are focused on web-based technologies. And a lot of these technologies are things that didn't even exist 8-10 years ago when we were working on the data standardization program.
So, what has been the biggest lesson you've learned relating to your work, and or have there been any specific instances where you had to go through a certain trial, or do you have any war stories about bad experiences that you've had, learning experiences?
Well, I've learned a lot. I guess one of the things we've had to deal with once or twice in the Department of Defense, you have to always designate whether you're working with classified information or not. The primary work that we've done has been with unclassified information. You always add extra layers of difficulty and requirements when you work in classified or secret information. But you know, when we managed a repository of all this metadata, it was unclassified, and while people had to have passwords and so forth to get into it, it was stated up front that it was unclassified, and so you had contractors and others who really weren't government employees and so forth and weren't cleared for classified information going in and using it. Well, in any case, once or twice we had situations where someone entered some data that where some of the metadata about it was classified. So suddenly you had to go through a big drill to...
Could you tell us some examples of classified information?
Well...
I'm just kidding.
Right. No, what I would say is, for example, in the case I'm thinking about, you know, what you often have in data is you'll have a certain piece of data, for example, eye color. And that piece of data will then have a list of codes. For example, for eye color, you'd have a list of codes. One code would mean brown, one would mean blue, one would be green, hazel, whatever. You know, you have a list of values for that piece of data, and then you'd have, so those codes would be, and for some pieces of data, you know, you'd have a list of codes, hundreds of codes long. For example, country code, and you'd have a list of codes for every country in the world. Well, anyway, sometimes the name of the data and the definition wouldn't be classified, but some of the codes might be. And so you had to watch out for that. And in the case I'm thinking of, where we did end up with some classified information in the system, that was the case. There were one or two of the codes in a list that we somehow learned actually were classified. So we had to go through a big drill of removing that and finding out how it got there and who knew and blah, blah, blah. The other big thing I've learned, and challenge we faced, was just what it's like to work in a big organization and trying to get people to cooperate and work together when you have sub-organizations with their own interests and budgets and goals.
It's not like a corporation where you're all working for the